This is a story where the past returns and forces a man to face a choice that could change everything. Stay with us until the very end, because what awaits you will be truly unexpected. Subscribe to the channel and leave a like so you won't miss the new stories we are already preparing for you. The silence of the Oregon mountains was broken only by the harsh sound of his own breath. Silas Vance woke with a jolt, heart pounding like a drum inside his chest. For a moment, he wasn't in his cabin. He was back in Afghanistan, choking on the smell of smoke and burning metal, watching men he knew disappear into dust and fire. He reached instinctively for a rifle that wasn't there. Then the silence returned, pressing down on him, and the only sound was the slow creak of the wooden beams above his head. The faint scent of pine and damp earth seeped in through the cracks of the cabin, pulling him back into the present. He sat up slowly, pressing his hands against his face, feeling the coarse stubble scratching his palms. 55 years old, yet in that moment he felt 100. The cabin was small, built from cedar that held its fragrance even after decades. There were only 2 rooms, furnished simply: a bed, a chair, a table with a stack of unopened letters, and shelves lined with tools he rarely used. He had built this retreat as both a refuge and a prison, a place where he could avoid the world. The world had taken enough from him already. It had taken his brothers in arms, and it had taken more than any war could when he lost his wife and daughter in a car accident on a rainy October evening. The memory never faded. He could still recall the phone call, the sterile voice on the other end telling him what had happened. It had been over a decade, yet the weight of that loss remained as sharp and merciless as the first night he heard it. His wife, Anna, had been the light in the years when war threatened to consume him. She had stood by him when he came home broken and distant, her hands steady and warm even when his own trembled from memories. His daughter, Lily, had been just 7, her laughter carrying through their small house like music. Their absence carved a hole in him that no battle scar could compare to. After their deaths, nothing in civilian life seemed worth holding on to. He had tried working as a foreman on construction sites, but his temper and his inability to connect with others drove him away. Friends fell away too, one by one, unable to pierce the wall of grief and anger he had built around himself. Eventually, he had chosen isolation, retreating into the mountains where no one would ask questions and no one would expect him to heal. He swung his legs over the edge of the bed and reached for his clothes laid neatly on the chair: a faded gray t-shirt, an old flannel shirt of navy and beige, jeans worn thin at the knees. The motions were automatic, a soldier's habit of order and routine. He pulled on his boots and rose slowly, joints stiff, body lean, but still strong from years of discipline. His eyes, however, betrayed him. They were tired, shadowed by decades of nightmares and regrets. He poured himself a cup of black coffee and sat at the small wooden table, staring at the unopened letters. They had arrived from the Veterans Affairs office, from outreach programs, from people who thought he might still care. He didn't. The coffee was bitter, but it grounded him, gave him something to hold on to in the quiet. That morning, however, was different. A restless energy moved in him, a need to do more than sit with his ghosts. He decided to enter the old shed attached to the cabin, a place he had avoided for years. The heavy wooden door groaned as he pulled it open, releasing a cloud of dust into the cold air. Sunlight slanted in, catching on cobwebs that hung like veils. The air was thick with the scent of old wood, rust, and forgotten things. Tools from generations past leaned against the walls, broken furniture piled in corners. He coughed, brushing dust from his shirt, and began to shift the clutter. As he worked, his hands fell upon something unusual. Beneath a stack of tarps and rotted boards sat a large wooden chest bound with iron bands. The wood was scarred, its once polished surface worn down by decades, perhaps centuries. He crouched, brushing away the dust until the outline became clear. The lock had rusted but crumbled under pressure, giving way with a reluctant snap. The lid creaked as he lifted it, releasing a breath of air that smelled of age and secrets. Inside lay relics of another time. A folded American flag with 48 stars, medals tarnished with age, a pair of lace gloves yellowed with time. And beneath them, resting like a hidden heartbeat, was a large leather-bound journal. Silas pulled it free, the cracked brown leather smooth under his calloused hands. Golden letters, faded but still legible, spelled out the name Captain Elias Vance, his great-grandfather. Silas sat back on his heels, staring at the book. He had heard the name before in family stories, a man who had served during the wars of the western frontier. But beyond that, Elias had been little more than a shadow in the family line. Now his words were here, tangible, waiting to be read. Silas hesitated, his heart beating faster than it had in months. The journal's pages were filled with careful cursive, the ink faded to sepia. The first lines described landscapes, military movements, mountains, rivers. But as he flipped through, the tone shifted. The entries grew heavier, darker. He spoke of promises made, of mistakes and regrets, of a place hidden deep within the wilderness, a place behind a roaring waterfall. Silas paused, fingers tracing the words. His cynicism told him these were the ramblings of a man long dead, stories with no weight in the real world. But there was something else in those lines, an echo of pain, of burden, of a promise unfulfilled. Closing the book, Silas sat in silence. Outside, the wind whispered through the pines as if urging him to look deeper. He thought of Anna. He thought of Lily. He thought of the hollow emptiness that filled his days. Perhaps, he wondered, this journal was not just a relic of the past. Perhaps it was a path, a direction, a way to carry the weight of his ghosts into something greater than himself. For the first time in years, he felt the faint stirrings of purpose, fragile but undeniable. He placed the journal on the table beside the cold cup of coffee. His gaze lingered on the name Elias Vance, embossed in faded gold. Whatever this was, wherever it led, it was more than the silence he had been living in. It was something. And in the desolate world of his grief, something was better than nothing. The journal lay on the table like an accusation, its cracked leather cover seeming heavier than its weight. Silas sat staring at it, his coffee cold and untouched as the morning crept through the cabin window. He had opened it once, skimmed the words, and felt the sting of something old and unresolved. Now, with the silence pressing on him, he pulled it closer, his fingers trembling slightly as he turned the fragile pages. Captain Elias Vance's handwriting was sharp and deliberate, the mark of a man educated and disciplined. The first passages spoke of routine campaigns, the kind of sanitized record a soldier might keep for posterity. Movements across the Western territories, skirmishes with hostile forces, and descriptions of mountains, rivers, and endless wilderness. But as Silas read further, the entries began to shift in tone. The clean structure faltered. The language grew heavier, almost desperate. One passage caught him immediately. Elias wrote of an encounter with a band of indigenous people, how orders were given to take their lands and scatter them. Silas felt his stomach tighten as he read. There was no pride in these words, only shame. Elias admitted that what had been called pacification was nothing less than brutality, raids carried out against families, villages reduced to ash. He described the sound of women crying, the sight of children running into the woods. The words were written as if each sentence was a wound the man inflicted on himself. Further into the journal, the tone grew darker still. Elias confessed that he and others had been led to plunder sacred objects, ceremonial masks, carved figures, adornments of gold and stone. The commanding officers saw only wealth. They wanted to melt the artifacts down, divide the spoils. But Elias, in his writings, admitted his horror. He described standing before a towering waterfall in the wilderness, led there by a native scout who trusted him against all reason. Behind that cascade of roaring water, Elias claimed, lay a cavern, a sacred place untouched by soldiers' hands. There, under cover of night, he hid what he could carry, vowing to return the treasures when the war ended. But the later entries betrayed failure. Elias wrote that his unit was ambushed weeks later and he was wounded. The scout who helped him disappeared into the mountains. He carried the knowledge of that hidden cavern, but he knew he would not see it again. His words bled regret. I failed them. I failed the promise. If my blood ever finds this, may they carry what I could not. May they return what was never ours to take. Silas closed the journal for a moment, his hands trembling. The cabin seemed smaller around him, its walls pressing close. He had lived years with his own failures, men lost under his command, a wife and child taken by fate when he was powerless to protect them. Reading these words, He felt the echo of his own broken promises. Elias had died with the weight of guilt in his heart, and now that burden felt alive in Silas's hands. He stood and paced the narrow floor, his boots thudding against the wood. The journal sat there on the table, daring him to look away, to dismiss it as a relic of a forgotten time. Yet the words would not leave him. They coiled in his chest, a quiet challenge. His whole life had been a retreat, a surrender to grief. Here now was something else, a mission, however impossible. His gaze drifted to the shelf above his bed, where a single photograph remained. Anna, smiling in the sunlight, her hand resting on Lily's shoulder. Lily's hair was caught mid-motion, wind tugging at it, her grin wide and fearless. Silas felt the ache rise sharp in his throat. He had failed them too. Failed to live. Failed to be the man they believed he was. Perhaps, he thought bitterly, all the Vance men were bound to carry unfinished promises. But as he looked back at the journal, something stirred beneath the grief. Not hope, not yet, but direction. His wife had always said he needed a purpose, that without it he was dangerous to himself. The army had given him one once. Anna and Lily had given him another. Now both were gone, and all that remained was silence. But here, in the frail pages of his great-grandfather's words, was a path, a chance not to erase the past. Nothing could do that, but to stand against it. He sat again, pulling the journal close, flipping back to the crude sketches Elias had drawn of mountain ridges and valleys. The ink was faded, the lines imprecise, but Silas recognized the outlines. These were the Oregon ranges, not so far from where he lived now. The waterfall, the cavern. It was here, hidden in the very wilderness he had chosen as his prison. The idea was madness. He was no longer young. His body was scarred and worn, his ankle still ached from an old injury. He had no companions, no safety net. The mountains were unforgiving. Yet, as the hours passed, the decision settled into him like stone. To stay was to continue dying slowly. To go was to risk everything. But for the first time in years, he felt the faint pulse of a mission. As dusk fell outside, Silas closed the journal gently and set it aside. He poured another cup of coffee, his hand steady now. Tomorrow, he told himself, he would begin. He would prepare. He would pack. And he would follow the path Elias left behind. If his great-grandfather had died with regret, perhaps Silas could die differently, having tried to set one thing right. And in that quiet resolve, as the night closed around his cabin, Silas felt the first flicker of something he thought he had lost forever, the will to move forward. The morning broke gray and cold, the mountain air sharp enough to sting Silas's lungs as he stepped outside. Frost clung to the edges of the cedar planks, and the pines surrounding his cabin stood silent and watchful. He moved with deliberate precision, a soldier's discipline returning to his body. For years, his routines had been empty gestures: make coffee, chop wood, survive another day. Now, every motion carried weight. He was preparing for something real. On the table inside, maps were spread open alongside the worn journal. Silas traced the faded sketches of his great-grandfather with one finger, then glanced back at the modern topographical charts he had kept from his time working construction in remote areas. The ridges and valleys lined up, imperfect but recognizable. The waterfall Elias described was out there, hidden within the folds of the Oregon wilderness. Silas studied the route, committing it to memory. He began packing his rucksack with practiced care: water purifier, rations, a small medical kit, a compass, fire starter, a tarp. Each item had a purpose, nothing more and nothing less. He wrapped the journal in oilcloth and slid it into the most secure compartment. As he worked, his thoughts turned inward. The cabin had been his fortress of isolation, but now it felt like a cage he was finally walking away from. He glanced once more at the photo of Anna and Lily, the edges worn from years of handling. Their eyes seemed to meet his, urging him onward. He tucked the photo into his breast pocket. By midday, he locked the cabin door and shouldered the pack. His boots crunched against the frozen ground as he started down the familiar logging road that led into the deeper forest. At first, the path was easy, the terrain known to him from years of wandering these hills. The rhythm of walking steadied his breath, but it also unlocked memories he had buried. He remembered the rain-slicked highway, headlights cutting through the storm, and the phone call that shattered his world. He had been sitting at a kitchen table, half drunk, waiting for Anna and Lily to return from town. Instead, he received the voice of a stranger telling him they would never come home. He had replayed that moment endlessly, wondering if he could have driven them himself, if he could have prevented fate's cruelty. That was the day the walls closed in, the day he stopped believing in tomorrow. The forest swallowed him as he left the road for a narrow trail. Pines rose high overhead, their branches whispering in the wind. The ground sloped upward, demanding more of his strength. Sweat gathered beneath his shirt despite the cold. Each step felt like a test, but he forced himself to keep moving. The journal's sketches guided him, ridge lines, bends and rivers, landmarks crudely drawn. Hours passed, and with them came the shadows of war. A branch snapped behind him, sharp as a rifle crack, and his body reacted before his mind could stop it. He dropped low, muscles coiled, heart racing, waiting for an enemy that wasn't there. The echo of gunfire lingered in his ears. He pressed his palm against the earth, grounding himself, whispering Anna's name under his breath until the ghostly battlefield faded back into forest silence. He rose unsteadily, breathing hard, his chest tight with anger at himself. The war was over, yet it lived inside him still. As the trail wound higher, the land grew harsher. Rocks jutted through the soil, and the incline burned in his thighs. He paused at a clearing, looking out across the endless ridges stretching into the horizon. The sky was a dull silver, clouds heavy with the promise of snow. He felt both small and strangely alive, as if the land itself was testing him. By late afternoon, he reached a stream cutting through the forest, its water cold and fast. He knelt, filling his canteen, watching the current swirl over stones. The sound reminded him of Lily's laughter, bright and uncontainable. He closed his eyes, letting the memory wash over him. For years, he had avoided thinking of her voice, the pain too sharp. But here, on this path, it felt different. It was not just loss. It was a reminder of why he could not turn back. He made camp as the sun dipped behind the peaks. The tarp became a makeshift shelter, a small fire crackled in front of him, and the journal lay open on his lap. He studied Elias's words again, this time reading slower, absorbing the desperation between the lines. His great-grandfather had carried guilt until his last breath. Silas recognized it too well. Their failures mirrored each other, broken promises, lives lost, a weight no one else could see. As night closed in, Silas sat by the fire, staring into the flames. The forest around him was alive with unseen movement, the cries of distant owls, the rustle of branches. He pulled the photograph from his pocket, holding it close. "I'll see this through," he whispered, his voice rough with conviction. "For you. For all of us." The firelight flickered across his weary face, and for the first time in years, he felt more than grief. He felt the faint stirrings of resolve, a fragile thread connecting him to something beyond his own suffering. The journey had only just begun, and already the mountains were stripping him bare. He lay down on the cold ground, the journal tucked under his arm, and let the darkness take him. Tomorrow, he knew, the real trials would begin. The wind shifted with a sudden, cutting chill as Silas pushed deeper into the mountains. Morning light was faint, the sky smeared with gray, and the trail beneath his boots had turned treacherous with patches of ice. He moved carefully, his breath fogging in the cold air, every step a reminder that he was no longer the man who had marched endless miles in the desert. His body was slower now, worn and stubborn, but his mind clung to the mission. The journal pressed against his chest inside the pack, and the photograph of Anna and Lily lay safe in his pocket, a constant weight against his heart. The terrain grew crueler. Ridges of sharp rock jutted upward, forcing him to climb with aching knees and burning lungs. Snow began to fall, thin at first, then heavier, blotting out the distance. The once clear outlines of Elias's crude maps blurred against the reality of the land. Silas stopped often to catch his breath, leaning on his trekking pole, scanning the horizon for landmarks that matched the sketches. The storm gathered around him, turning the forest into a white blur. It was then the past came rushing back. The howl of wind became the roar of helicopter blades. The snap of branches morphed into the rattle of machine gun fire. Silas froze, gripping his pole like a weapon. His heart pounded violently, every nerve on fire, his eyes searching for enemies that weren't there. He sank to his knees, clutching the frozen ground, caught between two worlds, the silent Oregon wilderness and the blazing hell of Afghanistan. Through the panic, he heard a voice. Not in the forest, not in the present, but within him. Anna's steady tone, soft yet commanding. Breathe, Silas. Come back. Then another, lighter, brighter, Lily's laugh echoing like a bell. Daddy, get up. His throat tightened, eyes burning with tears he refused to shed. The storm raged, but the memories anchored him, pulling him back to the present. He forced his lungs to slow, drawing deep, painful breaths until the phantom battlefield faded. He wiped the sweat and snow from his face and rose again, trembling but standing. By midday, the storm was in full fury. Snow whipped across the ridges, visibility shrinking to almost nothing. Silas pressed forward, each step a battle against the wind. His boots slipped on hidden ice, and more than once he had to drop to his hands to keep from tumbling down the slope. The cold bit into him, gnawing at his fingers and seeping through his layers. Hours blurred together until exhaustion made his movements clumsy. Then disaster struck. As he edged across a narrow ledge, his foot slid on a patch of ice. His body twisted violently, and he fell hard. Pain erupted in his ankle with a sickening crack. He cried out, the sound lost in the storm, and lay gasping in the snow. When he tried to put weight on the leg, fire shot through him. His ankle was ruined, useless for walking. Panic clawed at him. The storm was relentless, the temperature dropping, and he was alone with an injury that could mean death in the wilderness. He crawled to a boulder for shelter, dragging his pack behind him. His breath came ragged, his chest tight with dread. The snow piled quickly, covering him in a cold shroud. He thought of Anna's face, of Lily's small hand in his. The memory cut him open, raw and unbearable. He wanted to give in, to let the storm take him, to finally join them in the silence beyond. But another part of him fought back, fierce and desperate. He had come too far to end it here. Through the blinding snow, he spotted the shadow of a rock wall, a dark line against the white. Hope flared. He clawed his way toward it, using his trekking pole as a crutch, dragging his useless leg through the drifts. Every movement was agony, but he refused to stop. At last, half buried in snow, he found the mouth of a shallow cave, little more than an indentation in the mountain, but enough to shield him from the wind. He collapsed inside, chest heaving, the storm howling just beyond. The cold still gnawed at him, threatening to steal his strength. With trembling hands, he pulled the tarp from his pack and spread it across the floor, wrapping himself as tightly as he could. He lit a small fire with numb fingers, the flames sputtering but catching at last. The warmth was feeble, yet it was life. He sat huddled against the stone, his ankle throbbing with every heartbeat. Night fell, the storm raging outside, but within the cave there was silence, save for the crackle of fire. Silas held the photograph of Anna and Lily close, his thumb brushing their faces. "I'm not done," he whispered hoarsely. "Not yet." The words were more vow than comfort. He leaned back, staring at the flicker of light on the cave walls. His body ached, his spirit wavered, but he had survived another day. In the shadows of that storm-tossed night, Silas understood something he had not before. This journey was not just about his great-grandfather's promise. It was about his own survival, not of his body, but of his soul. To turn back now would be to surrender completely, to let grief and failure define the last of his days. To go on, broken as he was, meant there was still a chance to make something right. He closed his eyes at last, the fire warming his battered frame, the storm's fury muffled by stone. Sleep came slowly, carrying him into uneasy dreams. Outside, the snow fell heavy, burying the trail he had taken. Ahead, unseen in the darkness, lay the waterfall, roaring endlessly through the night, waiting for him. When dawn broke, the storm had spent itself. The world outside the cave was muffled in white, blanketed in snow that gleamed under a pale sky. Silas stirred, every muscle stiff, his ankle throbbing with a relentless ache. He tested it cautiously, biting down hard as pain shot up his leg. It would hold, just enough, with the aid of his trekking pole, though each step promised agony. He bound it tightly with strips of cloth torn from his spare shirt, bracing it as best he could. The mission had not ended. Not yet. He packed with deliberate care, extinguished the fire, and stepped back into the silence of the snow-covered mountains. The air was crisp, almost painfully pure. He hobbled forward, each step slow and deliberate, following the landmarks burned into his memory from the journal. The peaks loomed higher, ridges twisting into unfamiliar patterns, but the sketches of Elias guided him like faint echoes of another man's footsteps. Hours passed in silence, broken only by his uneven breathing and the crunch of snow underfoot. His thoughts drifted as he walked, memories of Anna and Lily threading through his mind. He saw Anna's hands as she folded laundry by the window, sunlight glinting on her wedding ring. He heard Lily's voice calling him from the yard, demanding he push her higher on the swing. Those memories, once unbearable, now became the rhythm that carried him forward. Each step was for them. Each breath was defiance against the emptiness that had ruled him for years. By midday, the land began to change. The forest thinned, replaced by jagged stone walls that rose like sentinels. A distant roar reached his ears, faint but distinct, vibrating through the ground more than through the air. Silas froze, heart quickening. He knew that sound. Waterfall. He pressed onward, the noise swelling with every step until it filled his chest with its steady thunder. At last, the trees parted, and he stood before it. The waterfall roared down from a cliff hundreds of feet high, a wall of water so powerful it seemed to shake the sky. Mist rose in great plumes, catching the weak sunlight, painting fleeting rainbows across the air. The force of it was overwhelming, raw and ancient, as if the mountain itself was alive and defiant. Silas stared, breathless. His great-grandfather had stood here. The journal had been right. He limped along the edge of the pool at the base, studying the sheer stone walls. The water pounded into the basin with relentless fury, spray soaking his face and clothes. He searched for hours, eyes scanning for any sign of an entrance, any unnatural crack or ledge. Nothing. Just rock polished smooth by centuries of water's assault. Frustration mounted, gnawing at him. He sank onto a boulder, his ankle screaming, his breath coming in harsh gasps. Had this all been for nothing? A fool's errand, chasing the ramblings of a dead man. Evening settled, and the roar of the falls became almost unbearable, echoing in his skull. He closed his eyes, fighting despair. Then, faintly, he remembered Elias's words. Not too low, not too high, where the water speaks differently. Silas opened his eyes, forcing himself upright. He moved closer to the edge, listening. The sound was everywhere, overwhelming. Yet there he heard it. A change. A deeper, muffled echo behind the waterfall. Adrenaline surged. He tightened his pack and stepped into the icy water. The current seized his legs, nearly dragging him down, but he fought forward, leaning into the torrent. The roar was deafening, spray choking his breath, but he pressed on until he reached the place where the sound changed. Forcing himself through the curtain of water, he stumbled into sudden darkness. The air was damp and cold, the thunder of the waterfall reduced to a distant growl. He fumbled for his flashlight and flicked it on. The beam cut through the black, revealing walls of stone that stretched into a cavern, vast and silent. His breath caught. The space was filled with objects, rows of carved figures, ceremonial masks inlaid with jade, golden ornaments, woven fabrics that still held their colors despite the years. The cavern was no treasure hoard. It was a sanctuary, untouched since the day Elias had hidden these sacred objects away. Silas stepped forward, the beam of light trembling in his hand. He found a wooden chest near the far wall, its seal intact. With shaking fingers, he pried it open. Inside were pages wrapped carefully in oilcloth. The handwriting was unmistakable, Elias. Silas unfolded the final confession of his great-grandfather. The words were raw, etched with desperation. Elias admitted his part in violence against the tribes, the plundering of their homes, the desecration of their sacred sites. He confessed he had tried to undo the crime, but had failed to return what he had hidden. If you find this, the final line read, then the promise is yours. Return what I could not. Restore what we stole. Only then may the Vance name be free of this weight. Silas lowered the paper, his throat tight. The cavern seemed to press in on him, not with menace, but with expectation. Before him lay enough gold and relics to change his life forever. His pension was barely enough to live on. With even one artifact, he could have security, comfort, escape from years of poverty and pain. The temptation gnawed at him. He reached for a golden figurine, heavy and cool in his hand. He imagined selling it, imagined freedom. Then he pulled the photograph from his pocket. Anna's eyes, Lily's smile. They looked back at him as if asking a question. Who are you? He felt shame burn through him. To take the treasure would be to betray not only Elias's promise, but their memory. He set the figurine back, his decision made. His family had suffered enough from broken vows. He would not add another. Silas sank to his knees, bowing his head. I'll finish it, he whispered. For him. For you. For me. His voice echoed softly in the cavern, swallowed by the stillness. The weight of temptation lifted, replaced by something harder but cleaner, duty. As he rose to leave, he knew what had to come next. He would not hide this place again. He would find the descendants of those who had lost it, and he would return what was theirs. The mission was clear. For the first time in decades, Silas felt the burn of purpose in his blood. The journey down from the cavern was slower, heavier. Silas moved with care, his injured ankle bound tightly, his pack pressing into his shoulders. Yet the burden felt lighter than it had in years. The cavern still echoed in his mind, the golden masks, the woven cloths, the wooden totems resting in the shadows, and Elias's words scratched in haste more than a century ago. Return what was never ours to take. That line would not leave him. It was no longer only Elias's promise. It was his. 3 days later, after navigating ridges and valleys and finding his way back to a road, Silas stood in a gas station parking lot, staring at the payphone. His hands trembled as he pulled a scrap of paper from his pocket, numbers he had scrawled after hours of searching through old directories. The number of the tribal council office for the confederated tribes whose ancestors had lived in these mountains. For a long moment, he hesitated, the weight of his family's history pressing on him. Then he fed coins into the slot and dialed. The voice that answered was weary, polite, but distant. Silas introduced himself slowly, each word tasting strange in his mouth. My name is Silas Vance. I have something that belongs to your people. Something my great-grandfather promised to return. There was silence on the other end, followed by suspicion. We've heard stories like this before, the voice said. Why should we believe you? Silas had no answer but the truth. Because I can show you. 3 days later, he found himself in a modest community center on the edge of the reservation. The air smelled faintly of coffee and burning sage. Across from him sat 3 members of the tribal council. At the center was a woman in her 70s named Lena, her long gray hair braided with strands of blue. Her eyes were sharp, filled with both grief and endurance. Silas told them everything, about the journal, the trek, the cavern, the confession of Captain Elias Vance. He showed them the photographs he had taken with his phone, each image of masks, carvings, and sacred objects carefully documented. They listened in silence, faces unreadable. When he finished, the room was still. Lena leaned forward, her hands folded on the table. We have heard words like these before, she said quietly. Too often they are empty. Too often they end in more loss. Silas lowered his gaze. He had no argument, no defense. He only had his sincerity, raw and stripped bare. For a long moment, the gulf of history stretched between them, heavy with mistrust. Then something shifted. Lena's gaze softened, and she asked simply, Why now? Why you? Silas swallowed hard. His voice shook, but he forced the words out. Because I've lost everything else, my wife, my daughter, my men in war. I can't change any of that. But I can do this. I can finish what he couldn't. The silence deepened, and in that silence, for the first time, he felt the possibility of belief. A week later, Lena and a small group walked with Silas into the mountains. The roar of the waterfall grew louder as they approached, and the air was thick with mist. He led them to the hidden crack behind the cascade. Together they passed through, emerging into the vast cavern. When Lena's eyes fell on the treasures, tears filled them. She reached out a hand, not to take, but to touch the air above the artifacts as if to greet them. A low chant began, her voice rising and falling in a language that had lived in these mountains for centuries. The others joined, their voices weaving together, filling the cavern with sound that resonated deep in the stone. Smoke from burning sage drifted through the air, curling around the totems and masks. The ceremony was not for Silas. It was for the spirits, for the ancestors, for the artifacts finally being welcomed home. When the chanting ended, Lena turned to Silas. Her eyes, once guarded, now shone with quiet intensity. "You have carried your grandfather's burden," she said softly, "and now you have laid it down. The promise is kept. The debt is paid." Silas bowed his head, unable to speak, his throat thick with emotion. As they left the cavern, sunlight broke through the clouds, scattering across the mist. Silas paused at the edge of the water, staring back at the hidden place. He felt a shift deep within, a release. The ghosts that had haunted him, Anna, Lily, his fallen brothers, even Elias, were quieter now. For the first time in decades, silence did not feel like punishment. It felt like peace. Back at the community center, Lena walked beside him. "There are many like you," she said. "Men who return from war with their souls wounded. They wander, lost, without purpose. You have found yours. Perhaps you can help them find theirs." Silas nodded slowly, her words striking something true within him. His life was not over. A new mission had begun. That night, alone in a small room lent to him by the council, Silas pulled out the photograph of Anna and Lily. Their smiles met his eyes in the dim light. For the first time in years, he smiled back, a quiet, trembling smile. "I kept the promise," he whispered. "I made it right." And with those words, a man who had once lived only in grief allowed himself to believe in tomorrow. Every story leaves a mark on the heart and reminds us that even in the darkest times, there is always a path to a new purpose. Greater stories are yet to come, stories that will not leave you indifferent. Share this video with your friends, subscribe to the channel, leave a like, and don't forget to write in the comments where you are watching us from right now.